The malt floor at Cross Quay was warm the way a cowhouse is warm, from underneath and from the grain itself, and Keziah Fenn had been turning barley since 4 in the morning by the light of 2 horn lanterns hung on the tie beams. It is not hard work in the way that ditching is hard work. It is only work that never stops. The barley lies across the whole of a long, low brick floor to the depth of about 8 inches growing, and it must be turned with a wooden shovel and drawn about with a wooden rake so that it grows evenly and does not mat and does not heat, and it must be turned again 5 or 6 hours later, and again in the night, for 8 or 9 days together, until the little white rootlets have run, and the shoot is grown 2/3 of the way up under the husk, and the whole floor smells of cut apples and wet stone. If a maltster lets his floor heat, he has lost 40 pounds in a night. If he lets it dry, he has lost it slower. A maltster's floorman is paid 8p a day, and is trusted with more money than a curate sees in a year, and nobody outside the trade has ever once thought about it. Keziah Fenn had been on that floor since she was 15. She was 24 that winter, and she could tell, by walking the length of the piece in her stocking feet, which she did every morning before the lanterns were out, whether any part of it was 1.5 degrees warmer than the rest. And she was never wrong. And Mr. Gooderham, who had the maltings, knew she was never wrong, and paid her 8p a day like the others, and thought himself a generous man. That was the first of the 2 things about her, and it was the ordinary one. The second thing she had learned very early not to talk about. She could hear the water. Not the way anybody hears water. Anybody who lives on an estuary hears the tide. You cannot help it. It is under the floor of the whole town twice a day. Keziah Fenn could stand in the dark on the wall above Kesland Creek, with her back to the sea, and tell you the hour of the tide to within about 7 minutes, and whether it was making or taking off, and whether it was going to run higher than the book said, and whether there was weather 3 days out in the German Ocean, pushing water up the coast ahead of it. She did it by the sound of the flood going into the reeds, which changes its note as the water finds each new gutter, and by the smell, because a tide that has come a long way with a north wind behind it does not smell like one that has come up quiet, and by the birds, because the Dunlin lift off the flats at a certain state of water, and if they lift early, the water is early, and by the drag on the mud when she laid her hand flat on it. It was not second sight. It was that she had been put out on that wall at 5 years old by a woman who was determined that somebody should be able to do it after her, and she had stood there twice a day for 19 years, and somewhere in those years the water had stopped being a thing that happened to the town and had become a thing she could read like a page. The woman who put her there was Judith Ladbruk, and Judith Ladbruk had the tide mill at Kesland. Keziah's own account with the world was short. Her father, Amos Fenn, had gone over the bar in a smack in the March of 1809 with 3 other men and a boy, and the sea had given back 2 of them and not him. Her mother had lasted 5 years after that in the way that women did, and died of nothing anybody could put a name to in the back room of a house in Chandler's Row on a Tuesday afternoon in haymaking time. There had been 2 daughters. The elder, Amelia, was handsome and had a straight nose and knew it, and in the June of 1818 she married Mr. Hollis Garnham, corn factor of the Quay, and moved to a house with a fanlight over the door and a coach house behind it. and did not come to Chandler's Row. The younger, Keziah, had 11 shillings and 9 pence in a tin under a loose board, her mother's wedding ring on a bit of cord round her neck because it was too big for her, and a brass tide glass the size of a thumb that Judith Ladbruk had given her when she was 9 years old for calling a tide right against the book. Twice a day for 19 years, she had gone up to Kesland. The mill stood a mile below the town, where the creek came out of the marsh and joined the river, and if you did not know what you were looking at, you would think it was a barn that had got itself into difficulties. It was a long black weather-boarded building of 3 floors under a red pantile roof, standing with its feet in the water, on a footing of stone and old ship timber, with a granary of brick and flint set against it, a cottage at the landward end, and a wooden staging out over the mud where a barge could lie at high water and load. On the seaward side there was a quay wall, and the creek and the mud, and beyond that the river running down to the sea between 4 miles of saltings. On the landward side there was the pond. 39 acres of it. It was not a pond, as people mean a pond. It was a great, shallow arm of the old marsh that somebody in the reign of King Henry or before him had shut off with a bank, and it filled and emptied twice a day, and when it stood full to the sill, it held something over 11 million cubic feet of salt water, which is a figure that means nothing at all until you are standing on that bank at the top of a spring tide with the whole of it lying flat and silver from your boots to the reeds a mile off, and the gulls sitting on it and the wind combing it the wrong way. A tide mill is the simplest idea in England and the most tyrannical. The flood comes up the creek. It pushes open a set of great oak flap doors under the mill, which hang seaward and can only swing the one way, and it runs in and fills the pond, and at high water it stops, and the doors fall to behind it of their own weight and the weight of the water inside, and now you have 39 acres of the sea locked up on the wrong side of a bank. Then the sea goes down outside, and the pond stands up inside, and the difference between the two is your fall. You draw your penstock and let the pond out through the wheel, and the wheel turns and the stones turn, and you grind. You grind on the ebb. You grind while the fall lasts. When the outside water comes up again to meet the inside water, you stop, whether you have finished or not, and you wait. And the whole thing comes round again 50 minutes later than it did the day before, because that is what the moon does. In the springs, you may get 9 hours out of the 2 tides. In the neaps, you may get 4. In a bad neap in a dry summer with the pond low, you may get nothing at all. And if the sea will not have you at noon, then you get up at 1 in the morning and take what it will give you at 1 in the morning. And if that is not convenient, you are in the wrong trade. Everybody in that town could have told you how a tide mill works. What nobody outside Kesland could tell you was how many hours of grinding any particular tide was going to give, before it gave them. That was the whole of the business. A maltster in Woodbridge who wants 80 quarters ground and shipped by Friday does not care that you are a picturesque survival. He wants to be told a day and an hour. The post mill on Cross Hill can tell him a day and an hour if the wind serves, and cannot if it does not. The new steam mill on the quay could tell him any day and any hour he liked, which was exactly why it had been built. Judith Ladbruk had ground on that tide for 51 years. She had come to it a bride of 22 in 1772, and her husband had been knocked off the staging by a swinging sack 6 years later, and killed on the stones below, and she had put on her cap the next morning and gone on with it, and she was doing it still at 78, with a stick and one eye gone milky and a voice like a 5-barred gate. She was very small, and bent nearly double, and she had a nose like a curlew's bill, and quick black eyes and a face folded like a walnut, and she wore black and a plain white cap, and a grey worsted shawl, and she had been feared in that district for half a century, for one reason only, which was that she had never in her life said a thing she could not stand on. And she had a book. It was not one book, it was 93 of them. Brown calf, foolscap folio, standing on a shelf of their own in the counting house at the mill under a curtain of green baize to keep the dust off, and every one of them was a year. On the 29th of September, 1731, a man called Ephraim Ladbruk, who was Judith's husband's grandfather, had gone down the wall to the sluice arch at high water, with a plumb line and a lantern, and had written down the height of the water above the mill sill in feet and inches and eighths, and the hour and the minute by the mill clock, and the wind and the weather, and how many hours of head he had got out of that tide, and what he had ground with it. And from that day to the day she was born, nobody at Kesland Mill had ever missed one. Not in the great frost. Not in the week the kiln burned. Not on the day Ephraim Ladbruk was carried up to the church, when his widow went down the wall at 4:30 in the morning in her mourning, and did it herself with the lantern in her teeth. Twice a day, 706 or 7 times a year, 93 years. Something over 65,000 entries in 11 different hands, all of them ruled the same way, and headed the same way, running from the reign of King George II to the reign of King George IV without one gap that anybody could find, and several people had tried. The last 11 years of it were in Keziah Fenn's hand, because Judith Ladbruk's eyes had gone. And down at the bottom of the wall set into the brickwork of the sluice arch, where the mill's own water came through, there was a block of pale stone about the size of a coffin lid, brought there from somewhere else a long time ago because there is no stone in Suffolk, and across the face of it, cut with a chisel, there were lines. Not many. 5 plain shallow grooves at different heights, with a date cut small under each one, and above the whole of them, in letters nearly weathered away, 6 words that Ephraim Ladbruk had not been the man to put there, because they were older than he was. The lines were the great tides, 1692, low down and nearly gone, 1703, which was the year of the great storm, a hand's breadth above it, 1717, which was the highest of them all, cut deep and long and square, as if the man who cut it had been in a temper, 1758, and last, 1791, 3 inches below the 1717 line, which 4 men in that town were still alive to remember, and would tell you about at any length you liked. Every child born at Kesland was taken down and shown that stone before it was 6 years old, and made to lay its hand flat on the 1717 groove, which for a child of 6 is above the top of its own head, and told what the 6 words said. Keziah Fenn had been taken down and shown it in the August of 1805 by a woman of 60, who had to hold her up under the arms to make her reach. On the 11th of February, 1823, a boy came up the outside stair of the malt house at 7 in the morning and stood on the top step dripping, because it had been raining since Candlemas, and said, "Miss Fenn, you are to come. She is asking." Keziah put down her shovel and looked along the floor and saw that the far end by the kiln wall would want turning before noon, whoever did it, and said so to the man nearest her, and took her shawl off the nail and went. She went out of the town past the churchyard and along the top of the marsh wall with the rain coming level off the river, past the eel bucks lying up on their trestles for the winter, past the place where the wall had been mended after the tide of 1808 with faggots and blue clay, and down the last stretch where you can see the mill. There is a thing that happens to a person coming along that wall, who has been coming along it since childhood, and it happened to her that morning, as it always did, and it never once stopped happening for the rest of her life. You come round the last bend, and the wall carries you up above everything, and the whole of it opens at once, the mill sitting black and square in the water, the granary beside it, the staging, the creek running out between the flats, the river beyond that, and on your left hand the pond, 39 acres of the sea lying quiet inside its bank with the wind on it, and over the top of the whole lot the sky, which in that county is 9/10 of what you are looking at. She was at the door in 20 minutes. Judith Ladbruk was in the room over the counting house, in the bed she had been born in, which had been carried there on a cart from a farm at Aiken in 1744. She was propped on 3 bolsters with her face to the little square window in the end wall, which does not look at the sky and does not look at the road, but looks straight down the length of the pond, because the man who cut that window in 1761 had known exactly what he intended to be looking at when his time came. Old Mrs. Bunce from the cottage was at the fire. Mr. Fairweather the surgeon had been and gone and left a bottle that nobody was going to open. Keziah took off her wet shawl and hung it on the door and sat down on the edge of the bed and took the old woman's hand, which was brown and knotted and cold as a key. "You are wet," said Judith Ladbruk, without turning her head. "It is raining. It has been raining since Candlemas." "Yes, what was the water this morning?" 11 foot 2 above the sill at 7 minutes past 6, said Keziah. "Wind southwest, strong and dirty. 4 hours and 40 of head, and I gave the whole of it to Miss Nesling's barley, because he has a boat Thursday." The old woman lay still and looked out of the window at the pond. "You will have written it down." "I wrote it down." "Good," said Judith Ladbruk. "Because it is going to matter, and not to us." There was a long silence in the room, and the rain went on at the window, and downstairs somebody was moving sacks. "I have had you up on that wall since you were 5, said Judith Ladbruk at last. "Do you know why?" "Because there was nobody else," said Keziah. "There was my nephew at Blytheburg, and there was a boy at Snape who was quick," said the old woman. "There were 4 or 5 over the years. I had every one of them out on the wall, and I sent every one of them home. It was not because there was nobody else. It was because there was nobody else who was any good." Keziah looked down at the hand in hers and did not say anything, because there was nothing you could say to that and be decent about it. "Now attend to me," said Judith Ladbruk, "and get that stubborn look off your face, because I have not the wind to say a thing twice." There is going to be trouble on this water. Not this year. Soon, when a marsh is worth 8 shillings an acre, nobody looks at it. And when it is worth 30 an acre, everybody does. And barley has been dear since the war, and men have got money and no sense. Somebody is going to come up this river with a plan in his hand and a subscription list behind him, and he is going to want to shut the sea out of 400 acres of Kesland level and put beasts on it. And when he does that, he takes the room away. The room, said Kezia. The room the water has, said the old woman. That is the whole of it. That is the whole of everything I know, and it took me 51 years. A great tide is not a wall of water like a picture in a book. A great tide is an ordinary tide with too much of it, and it does not care in the least about your bank, and it does not go anywhere it has not been. It goes where it went the last time. And if you have filled up where it went the last time with somebody's beasts and somebody's ditches, it does not stop. It goes over the top, and then it goes through, and then it takes the lot. She stopped and got her breath back, which took a while. They will tell you nothing like it was ever known, she said. They always say that. It is the first thing out of their mouths, and it is always a lie, and it is not even a clever lie, because it is written down. It is written down on that shelf downstairs, and it is cut in that stone at the bottom of my wall, and every man of them walks past that stone twice a week, and has never once looked at it, because it does not shine, and it does not cost anything. I know the stone, said Keziah. Then say me the 6 words. Keziah said them. Again, said Judith Ladbruk. She said them again. That is right, said the old woman. That is all there is. Everything else is arithmetic. She was quiet for some time after that, and Keziah thought she had gone to sleep, and then she said, without opening her eyes, You will not be able to grind. No, said Keziah, you cannot dress a stone. You cannot hang a wheel. You cannot cut a cog, and you have not the arm to lift a bedstone. And you have never in your life set a shaft. No. Then you will get somebody who can, said Judith Ladbruk, and you will pay him properly, and you will not pretend to him that you can do it, because that is how they find out you are a fool. What you have got is the water. Nobody in this county has got the water but you. Do not let go of it, and do not sell it, and do not, whatever else you do, let anybody tell you that it is old-fashioned. There is nothing old-fashioned about the moon. Then she said, Get on back to your floor, girl. They will have let it heat. Judith Ladbruk died on the 19th of February, 1823, at about 20 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, on the ebb, which 4 separate women in that parish afterwards said they had expected, and they were all lying. She was buried on the 23rd at the church on the hill in rain that came off the sea sideways. There is a thing that happens at a Marsh funeral. The people come along the walls, which are the only ways there are, and you see them for a mile before they arrive, strung out in 1s and 2s and 3s on the top of the banks in black, coming from Aiken and from Sudbourne, and from the ferry and from the town, so that the whole flat country seems to be leaking mourners very slowly towards one point. There were 240 people in that churchyard. Almost none of them had ever had a kind word out of her. The Reverend Mr. Ashby read the service with the water running off the brim of his hat. Old Simeon Studd, who was the Marshman at Kesland and had been for 41 years, stood at the graveside with his hat in his two hands and his white stubble shining wet, and did not blink once. Nat Pallant, the mill boy, who was 19 and enormous, and had cried twice already that morning behind the granary where he thought nobody could see, held himself together by staring at a yew tree. Keziah Fenn stood at the head of the grave in a black gown borrowed from Mrs. Bunce that was too long in the sleeve. On the other side of it, under a good umbrella held for him by a servant, stood Mr. Hollis Garnham. He was 36, and he was a big man, broad and thick through the chest, going florid, a wide, clean-shaven face, sandy brows, small, close-set blue eyes, and a mouth that never quite shut. Bottle green tailcoat, buff waistcoat, high collar, spotted neckcloth, top boots polished that morning and already ruined. He had come out from the quay with his wife in a carriage as far as the ferry and walked the last half-mile on the wall like everybody else, and it had put him in a temper he was managing very well. Beside him, holding her skirts up out of the mud, stood Amelia Garnham, who was 28 and handsome and had her mother's chin, and who looked once across the grave at her sister and then did not look again. The will was read 2 days later, on the 25th, in the little parlour of the mill cottage, by Mr. Rednall the attorney, who had come down from the town on a pony and was wet to the knee. There were 7 people in that room. Mr. Rednall at the table with his box, Keziah on a hard chair with her hands in her lap, Simeon Studd standing at the door because he would not sit, Mrs. Bunce, Nat Pallant on the stairs, listening, where he had been told not to be, and by the fire, taking up most of it, Mr. and Mrs. Hollis Garnham. Mr. Rednall took his time. Attorneys did in those days, and he was not going to be hurried by anybody, least of all by a corn factor. He read the preamble and the small bequests. £5 to Mrs. Bunce, £10 and the pony to Simeon Studd, £3 to the poor of the parish, to be laid out in coals and not in bread, which was underlined. A gold mourning ring to Mrs. Amelia Garnham, being her late husband's sister's granddaughter, which is the kind of relation that only matters in wills. Then he stopped and looked over his spectacles at Keziah and read the residue. To Keziah Fenn, spinster, of Chandler's Row in the said parish, the tide mill at Kesland with all its stones, gearing, wheels, hoists, tackle, weights and measures, the granary of brick and flint, the staging, the quay wall and the wharfage, the cottage, the sluice, the arch, the flap doors, the penstock and the waste hatches, the mill pond of 39 acres 2 roods and 11 perches and the bank thereof, the right of taking eels in the creek between the 2 posts, the right of way along the wall from the town, and the whole of the books, papers, journals, tide books, plans, and memorandums of the said mill, which were not to be sold, given, lent, or divided from the mill in any circumstances whatsoever, at any price, to any person, upon pain of the whole devise falling in. And then he read the rest of the residue, which was £287 14 of debt, a mortgage of £160 to the executors of the late Mr. Kemble at 4.5%, and an outstanding order for 60 quarters that ought to have gone out in January, and had not, because the miller had been dying. Keziah Fenn sat quite still and heard the whole of it, and did not change her face. Then Mr. Rednall turned the sheet over and said, "There is one more. Item," he read, "to Miss Hollis Garnham, corn factor, of the quay 1 shilling, and with it the brass tide gauge, and the lead and line belonging to this mill, being the same that were used by Ephraim Ladbruk, the said shilling, and the said gauge to be delivered into his own hand in person before witnesses, and without any explanation whatsoever. Mr. Rednall put down the paper and took out of his box a shilling and a black japanned tin case, and got up and walked across the parlour and put them into Hollis Garnham's hand. Nobody said anything. Garnham looked at the shilling. He turned the case over once. Then he laughed, twice, the way a man laughs when he has decided to. The old woman was gone in the head this 12-month, he said. Everybody knew it. She made that will in 1819, said Mr. Rednall pleasantly, and she came into my office on her own 2 feet to do it, and she read it herself, and she made me alter 3 words in it, because she said I had been slovenly. Good day to you, sir. Afterwards there was a gathering at the Jolly Sailor on the quay, because there always is, and because Kesland Cottage would not have held 30 people. They gave them bread and cheese and hot ale and a ham, and the room filled up with wet black wool and steam, and everybody stood about, and the talk got round, as it does, to what she had left and to whom. Keziah stood near the door with a glass of ale somebody had put in her hand and had not drunk, and Hollis Garnham, with his back half turned to her, and his glass up, and his voice pitched exactly loud enough to reach the far wall, said to the 2 gentlemen he was standing with, "She has been left a hole in a marsh that fills twice a day, and a shed on legs, and a wheel that turns when the sea gives it leave. 39 acres of mud, gentlemen, and the tide comes free. I should say the timber in the granary is worth 140, and the rest of it is worth what you would pay to be shut of the debt on it." He drank, and 200 years of somebody writing down how wet the mud was, he said, in 93 volumes. Bound. In calf. The room laughed. It was not a cruel room. That is the thing that people get wrong about it afterwards. It was a room of marshmen and quaymen and shopkeepers and maltsters' clerks who had all just been in the rain at a funeral and were glad of the ale, and the joke was a decent enough joke about mud, and they laughed the way people laugh in a warm room, and it went round the whole of it, and it took about 4 seconds, and then somebody said something about the ferry. Amelia Garnham did not laugh. She looked at the fire. Keziah Fenn set the ale down on the window ledge without drinking it, and went out. She walked home along the wall. It was going dark by then, and the rain had stopped, and the wind had got round into the north, and the tide was 2 hours down and running hard out of the creek, and the whole flat country was that colour it goes at the end of a wet winter day, which is not grey, and is not blue, and cannot be painted. She came round the last bend, and the mill opened out in front of her, black against the last of the light, with the pond behind it standing full and quiet and holding the whole sky upside down. £287 14. She stood on the bank for a while. Then she went down and unlocked the counting-house and lit a candle and pulled the green baize curtain back off the shelf, and looked at the 93 brown books standing there in their row, with the years on the spines, from the reign of the 2nd George to that afternoon. She took down the last one, which was hers, and she opened it on the sloping desk, and she trimmed the candle, and she went out along the wall to the sluice arch with the lantern and the leaden line, because the tide gauge was in a japanned case in a corn factor's pocket, and she knelt on the wet brick and took the height of the water at the stone. Then she came back and sat down on the high stool, and wrote the day and the date, and wrote 4'1" above sill, half after 5, wind north, moderate, clear after rain. And in the last column, which is for what was ground on that tide, she wrote nothing at all, because nothing had been ground on it, and she was not going to be the first person in 93 years to put down a thing that was not so. The next morning she was at Kesland at 10 minutes before 7, and they were waiting for her in the yard. There were 3 of them, and the boy, Simeon Studd, the Marshman, 70 years old, in his long canvas smock and his leggings, with his hat on. Reuben Chenery, the miller's man, 52, who had been on those stones since he was 14, and who had a bad hip and a worse temper. Jarvis Mean, who carted. And Nat Pallant, 19, standing a little apart with his hands hanging. They had their hats on. That is the detail she remembered for 50 years. Men take their hats off to a master. She went up the 3 steps of the granary door and turned round, and stood there with her hands at her sides and looked at them. "I am not going to tell you it will be all right," she said. Nobody moved. "There is £287 of debt on this mill, and £160 of mortgage, and there is 60 quarters owing to Mr. Gooderham that ought to have gone out in January, and has not. The wheel wants 19 new floats, and I think it wants a gudgeon. The runner stone on the near pair has not been dressed since Michaelmas, and Reuben has been telling her so since Michaelmas, and she would not have the money spent. The pond has silted at the head by, I should say, 14 inches in 11 years, and nobody has scoured it since the year I was born." Reuben Chenery shifted his weight and looked at her differently. "I cannot dress a stone," said Keziah Fenn. "I cannot hang a wheel, I cannot set a shaft, and I have not the arm to lift a bedstone, and I am not going to stand here and pretend to any of you that I can, because you would know inside a week and then I should be finished." Nat Pallant looked at his boots. "What I can do," she said, "is tell you what the water is going to do. To the quarter of an hour, on any tide, 13 months ahead. That is not a boast. 2 of you have watched me do it since I was a child, and 1 of you taught me the half of it." Simeon Studd took his hat off. "I will pay Saturday," said Keziah, "and if I cannot pay Saturday, I will say so on the Thursday and not on the Saturday night, which is the only promise I am in a position to make anybody. That is all I have got. You may take it, or you may go up to the quay, where Mr. Garnham's new engine will want firemen by Lady Day, and will pay 11 shillings. Reuben Chenery took his hat off, slowly, as if it hurt him, which it did, because of the hip. Jarvis Mean took his off. Nat Pallant had already lost his somewhere, and stood there very red. "That is the whole of it," said Keziah Fenn. "Reuben, get the near pair up." The mill was in a worse state than she had said out loud, because there is no sense in telling men on a Wednesday morning the whole of what is wrong with the thing they are standing in. The great wheel was 15 feet in the diameter and 9 feet wide, which is a wide wheel, because a tide mill has a small fall and must take its power out of quantity instead. 19 of its floats were rotten enough to put a thumb through, and 4 were gone altogether. It had been running like that for 2 years, and every stroke of it was throwing water away. The gudgeon at the near end of the wheel shaft, which is the iron journal the whole thing turns on, had worn oval, and when the wheel was under load, you could stand in the pit and watch the shaft lift and drop the 1/8 of an inch, thump, 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 all day, which is the sound of a mill eating itself. The pit had been let get foul. The flap doors under the sill wanted new heel irons. The penstock rack was worn on 3 teeth. The sack hoist would not hold a full sack above the second floor without slipping, which is how men are killed. There was dry rot in one of the granary posts. And the trade was gone. That was the true difficulty, and no amount of new elm floats was going to touch it. In 1811, Kessland had ground 1,100 quarters in the year. In 1822, it had ground 430. The new steam mill on the quay, which was Hollis Garnham's, ground night and day, and did not care about the moon. And it had taken the town trade first, because the town trade wants regularity. And then it had begun on the maltsters, because the maltsters want regularity most of all. Keziah sat in the counting house that first Sunday, with the books open in front of her, and did the arithmetic 4 times, and got the same answer 4 times, which was that on the present trade she would be sold up by the November. Then she took a clean sheet and did a different sum. On the 4th of March, at about 5:30 in the evening, in a fine cold drizzle, a man came up the wall from the town and stopped at the mill gate. Nat Pallant saw him first, and went and fetched her, and she came out of the counting house with the lantern and held it up. He was very tall, 6'2" at least, and lean the way a man is lean who has been walking, with straight black hair long enough to fall over his forehead, and a long, bony, clean-shaven face with high cheekbones, and pale grey-green eyes that did not slide about. He was sunburnt to the collar. He had a canvas bag over his shoulder with the corners of tools showing through it, and a leather belt with a rule pocket, and he had good boots that had been mended badly. He put down the bag and took his hat off. "They tell me in the town you have got a wheel once floating," he said. "Who tells you?" "A man on the ferry, and a woman in a shop who told me not to bother, because you have got no money." Keziah Fenn looked at him for a moment. "That is true," she said. He nodded, as though that were only reasonable. "Jonas Thurkettle," he said. "Millwright. I was 7 years with Duffield and Son at Norwich and 4 on my own account, and Duffield and Son went in the November and took my 4 with them. I have walked from Norwich by Yarmouth and Lowestoft and Southwold looking for work, and there is none, because nobody puts up a windmill any more, and nobody mends one either. They wait for the engine to come." "What is it you want?" "7 days," said Jonas Thurkettle. "My keep and my tools sharpened, and 7 days. At the end of the 7 days you will pay me what you think the work was worth, and if you think it was worth nothing, then you will say so, and I shall go on to Ipswich. Nobody works 7 days for nothing. I am not working for nothing," said the millwright. "I am working to be looked at. There is no other way I get looked at in this county at present, and I would sooner be looked at by somebody who is watching than by somebody who is not." She stood there with the lantern and the drizzle coming through the light of it. "You have not asked what is wrong with the wheel," she said. "I have been stood at your gate 1/4 of an hour," said Jonas Thurkettle, "and I have heard it. Your gudgeon is oval, and your shaft is lifting, and you have 4 floats out, and by the sound of the water going away I should say, the whole of that pit is choked with weed, and you are drowning your own tail. That is not clever. Anybody in the trade could hear it from the gate. It is only that nobody in the trade has stood at your gate." She opened it. That was the 4th of March. He worked the 7 days, and Nat Pallant, who had been told to help him, followed him about like a dog, and did not go home at nights. He got the wheel stopped at the top of a neap, when there was no head worth having and no trade to lose, and he went down into the pit with the boy and a pair of long-handled rakes, and got out of it. In a day and a half, 11 cartloads of black weed, silt, drowned sheep bone, 200 weight of oyster shell, a cartwheel, and a quantity of hemp rope that had been somebody's mooring warp in the last century, and when it was cleared the tailwater ran away 4.5 inches lower, and the mill got 4.5 inches more fall for nothing at all, twice a day, forever. Then he cut floats. There is a way of cutting an elm float for a tide mill wheel that is not the way you cut one for a stream mill, because a tide mill runs slow and deep and takes its work out of weight of water and not out of speed, and the float wants to be set a little more upright, and the clearance at the sole plate wants to be small, and the whole thing must be got so that the float enters the water without a slap. A slap is not noise. A slap is money. He cut them out of elm butts that Jarvis Mean fetched from a yard at Snape on account, and he set them with the adze and a chalked line. And he made the boy hold, and he did not talk while he worked, and he did not sing, and he only stopped when the tide came back over his boots, which it did, every day, whether he had finished the float or not. And he learned about that in the first 2 days, the way everybody does, and said afterwards that a tide mill teaches a man humility quicker than a church. On the 5th day he went up on to the wheel shaft with a set of wedges and lifted the whole of it in a sling made out of the mill's own tackle and Jarvis Mean's cart, and turned the gudgeon end for end, which is a thing you can do once with an oval journal and never twice, and packed it, and got the thump out of it. The mill ran on the evening tide of the 11th of March, and Keziah Fenn stood in the stone floor with her hand flat on the meal spout, and listened to it, and it was a different mill. She paid him £3.10, which was more than she could afford, and less than the work was worth, and she said so. "I will take £3.10 and the loft over the granary," said Jonas the kettle, "and 12 shillings a week from Lady Day, and I will find my own beer. There is no work here for a millwright after this." "There is 2 years of work here for a millwright," said Jonas the kettle. "You have just not looked at it, because you have been looking at the debt. Your penstock rack is worn. Your hoist will kill that boy before Whitsoon. Your granary post is rotten to the middle and holding up 11 ton of barley, and if you scoured the head of that pond you would gain, I should think, an hour of head on every spring tide in the year. There is a man's life of work here. There is only not any money." He put his hat on. "I have been 6 months looking for somebody who would let me do it properly," he said. "Everybody I have asked wants it done cheap by Friday. You cannot do a thing cheap by Friday in this trade and it stay done." She took him on. In the April she tried to dress a stone. She had watched it done 1,000 times. Reuben Chenery had the runner stone up on its edge against the wall on the crane, and the furrows chalked, and the mill bill in the handle, and it is only when you watch it, a man tapping a stone. So she waited until Reuben was over at the ferry, and she took the bill and the thrift, and she began at the top of a land. She spoiled 11 inches of a furrow in about 4 minutes, and struck her own knuckle twice, and got the fine grey grit of it into the back of her left hand where it stayed for the rest of her life, because that is what millstone does. It goes in under the skin and it never comes out, which is how you can always tell a stone dresser. You turn his hand over and there are little blue-black specks all over the back of it, and they call it showing the metal, and a man is not reckoned to be any good at it until he has got it. She was standing there with her hand bleeding when she heard him behind her. Jonas Thurkettle looked at the furrow for some time. Well, he said, you have shown the metal. It is spoiled. It is 11 inches of one furrow, and Reuben will take it out in half an hour and swear at you for a week, said the millwright. That is not what is wrong with it. What is wrong with it? You were trying to learn it in an afternoon, because you have got it in your head that you must be able to do everything in this mill, or you are not the master of it, said Jonas Thurkettle. You are wrong about that. I have known 4 masters in this trade. 2 of them could do every job in the mill, and both of them are bankrupt. Because a man who can do every job does every job, and then there is nobody stood outside looking at the whole of it. He took the bill out of her hand, not unkindly. Go and do the thing nobody else in England can do, he said, and let Reuben tap the stone. So she did. What she did with the water was this. And it was so simple that for the rest of her life she could not get anybody to believe it had been worth anything. At the end of every month she sat down in the counting house with the almanac and the 93 books, and she wrote out for the month coming a fair copy of every tide, the hour and the height of every high water, the hour the fall would come on, the hour the fall would go off, and, in the last column, the number of hours and minutes of grinding that Kesland Mill would have on that tide, allowing for the state of the pond and the time of year, and how much rain there had been on the marsh, because fresh water coming down out of the levels changes it, and for the wind, which she could not know a month ahead, and therefore allowed for by taking the worst. She had 11 of those sheets copied out by Nat Pallant, who wrote a slow, round schoolroom hand, and she walked them round. She walked them to Mr. Gooderham at Cross Quay, and to the 2 maltsters at Snape, and to the corn chandler in the town, and to 4 farmers at Sudbourne and Aiken and Chillisford, and to the brewer at Orford, and to a man at Butley, who kept 140 pigs. And to every one of them she said the same thing, standing in their doorways with her boots wet. I cannot grind when you want it, she said. I can grind when I say. Here is when I say, for the whole of next month, written down. Send me your barley by the day before, and I will have it back to you on the day and the hour on that sheet. If it is late, you may take 1 shilling a quarter off the bill for every day, and I will put that in writing, and you may hold it against me. Everybody said no in the March. Mr. Gooderham said yes in the April, because Mr. Gooderham had 60 quarters at Kesland already, and could not get them out any other way, and because he had watched Keziah Fenn walk a malt floor in her stocking feet for 9 years, and had a private opinion of her that he had never once shared with her, on the grounds that it would cost him money. Kesland ground those 60 quarters out in 11 days on 11 tides, and every sack of it went up to Cross Quay on the day named, and 1 lot went up 4 hours early, because the wind came into the northeast and pushed a foot more water into the pond than she had allowed, and she sent it early rather than sit on it, and Mr. Gooderham, who had a boat to catch, made £3 out of that. The brewer said yes in the May. The man at Butley said yes in the June, and said it in the marketplace in a loud voice, because a man who keeps 140 pigs is not delicate. By the harvest of 1823, Kesland Mill was grinding again. It was not grand. It was never going to be grand. The steam mill on the quay could do in a day what Kesland did in a fortnight, and there was no arguing with that, and she never tried. What she had found was the crack in it, and the crack was this: an engine costs money whether it turns or not. Coals cost money. Firemen cost money. An engine must be kept full to pay, and to keep it full a man must take work at any price, and he must take the near work, and the town work, and the hurried work, and he cannot afford to be particular. The moon does not send in a bill. Kesland's power was free. Kesland's power had been free since the reign of King Henry, and would be free in the reign of whoever came after King George, and every ebb tide that went down that creek without turning the wheel was the only thing in that mill that was ever truly wasted. So she could take the slow work and the awkward work and the cheap work, the little farmer's 40 quarters, the pig meal, the shops, and the middlings, the stuff the engine would not stoop to, and she could take it at a price the engine could not touch, and she could name the hour. By the Michaelmas, she had ground 690 quarters in the year. She had paid off 41 pounds of the debt. She had bought 19 elm floats, a new penstock rack, 200 weight of new rope for the hoist, and a second-hand pair of French burrs out of a mill at Wickham Market that had gone for scrap, and she had them laid on the floor of the granary under sacking waiting for the winter, which is when you do that work. And she had learned that she was not going to be forgiven for it. The meeting was on the 24th of June, 1823, in the long room of the King's Head on the quay. And it was very full. There was a plan pinned up on the end wall, 6 feet across and a section under it, and a young gentleman standing beside them with a pointer. And at the table sat Mr. Velicott of Ipswich, surveyor, a dry, narrow man of about 50 in black, with a bad cold, and beside him sat 4 of the principal subscribers, and in the middle of them, in the chair, sat Mr. Hollis Garnham. The scheme was called the Kesland Level Reclamation. It was 460 acres. It was the whole of the low marsh between the creek and the river, from the ferry to the point, which had been salting and grazing marsh and wildfowl and samphire and eels since the sea made it, and which flooded on the top of every spring tide the way a bath fills, and had done forever, and drained itself off again through 19 natural gutters and out at Kesland Haven. The plan was to put a wall round it 3 miles long, and cut a straight drain down the middle of it, and put a self-acting sluice with 2 pairs of doors at the haven, and pump nothing, because it would drain itself at low water, and let the rain wash the salt out of it over 3 years, and then put beasts on it. 460 acres of grazing marsh at 30 shillings an acre, said Mr. Hollis Garnham to the room, where at present, gentlemen, there is samphire, and there are eels, and there is a great deal of interesting mud. The room liked that. £900 a year, said Garnham, out of ground that at this moment pays this parish nothing whatsoever but the poor rate for the men who wildfowl on it. 600 shares at £10. I have taken 90 of them myself. There was applause. It was, on the face of it, an excellent scheme. Half the coast was doing it. Men had done it in Lincolnshire and made fortunes, and in Essex, and the Dutch had been doing it for 300 years. And there was not a man in that room who did not know somebody who had grown rich out of taking ground away from the sea. Keziah Fenn stood up at the back. She was in her working gown because she had come straight off the wall, and the room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when a woman stands up in it who is not there to hand round anything. "Mr. Vellacott," she said, "may I ask what height you are putting the crest of that bank?" The young gentleman with the pointer looked at Mr. Vellacott. Mr. Vellacott blew his nose and said, 12'6" above ordinary spring high water, madam, with a slope of 3-to-1 on the sea face and turfed, which I may say is a considerable wall. "Above ordinary spring high water," said Keziah. "That is the usual datum." "It is not the datum that matters," said Keziah Fenn. "The tide that will take that wall away will not be an ordinary spring high water." Somebody laughed. "Ordinary spring high water at Kessland is 11'6" above my mill sill," she said. "Your bank as you have drawn it stands then at 13'6" above my sill, or thereabouts, and you may check that against your own section. The tide of the 23rd of December, 1791, stood at 15'9" above my sill for 2 hours and 11 minutes. The tide of the 25th of December, 1717, stood at 16 foot even. Both of those are written down, and both of them are cut in the stone at my sluice arch, and you may go down at low water this afternoon and put your hand on them." The room was not laughing now, exactly, it was doing something else, which was worse. It was being patient. "Then your bank is 2'3" below the last one," said Keziah Fenn, "and 2'6" below the worst one, and there is no freeboard at all, and on the night it comes, gentlemen, your wall will not be overtopped by 1.5 inches and hold. It will be overtopped for 2 hours, and when a sea wall is overtopped, the water comes over the back of it and cuts the landward slope away underneath. And then it goes. And it does not go in one place. It goes in 11 places at once, and it takes 460 acres and everything standing on it in about 40 minutes. And I will tell you the other thing," she said, "and this is the one that will cost you, because the first one only costs you your own money. That marsh is where the water goes. It has gone there on the top of every great tide since before this town was here. It is the room. If you shut 460 acres of room off from the sea does not go home. It comes up the river, and it goes into the next place, and the next place is the low end of this town, and it is Chandler's Row and the quay and the maltings and the churchyard, and it will be in your parlours to the second stair." There was a silence of about 4 seconds. Then Hollis Garnham said, from the chair, easily not even standing up, "Miss Fenn keeps a diary of puddles," and the room came apart with laughing. He let it run. He was good at that. He waited until it had nearly stopped, and then he said, "And I mean no unkindness, ladies and gentlemen, none in the world. She has had a hard year, and she has been left a very difficult property, and it is not to be wondered at that she takes an interest in high water. But we shall not, I think, set aside the report of a gentleman of Mr. Vellacott's standing, and the practice of every commission of sewers in the eastern counties, upon the strength of a tide that happened in the reign of Queen Anne." "King George I," said Keziah Fenn. "I beg your pardon. 1717, said Keziah Fen. It was King George I. Queen Anne had been dead 3 years. If you are going to be contemptuous of a date, sir, you should get the date right. That is the moment the town remembered afterwards, and half of them remembered it wrong, and made it better than it was, and had her say all sorts of things she never said. What she actually said was that. And then she picked up her shawl and went out, and the door was heavy and did not slam, which she was sorry about for years. But Mr. Vellacott of Ipswich sat at that table with his handkerchief in his hand and did not laugh, and wrote something in the margin of his section. On the 19th of July, a young man came along the wall from the ferry with a satchel and stood in the doorway of the counting-house, turning his hat round and round in his hands. He was about 23, thin, with a bad shave and ink on 2 fingers, and his name was Ambrose Kersey, and he was Mr. Vellacott's chainman and clerk, and did the levels and carried the staff, and was paid 9 shillings a week and his lodging. Mr. Vellacott's compliments, he said, and would Miss Fen oblige him with the particulars she spoke of at the meeting. Keziah Fen put down her pen. Which particulars? The heights, said Mr. Kersey. The great tides. He says he wants them referred to your mill sill, and he wants your sill referred to the Trinity high water mark on the quay wall at Orford, and he wants to know how the observations were taken, and by whom and with what instrument, and he says, and I am to say this exactly, Madam, that if the answer to any part of it is that somebody guessed, he would rather be told so now than find it out in November. She looked at him for a moment, and then she smiled, which he was not expecting. Sit down, Miss Kersey, she said. You will be here 3 hours. He was there 5. She gave him the whole of it. She had the 93 books off the shelf and on the table in 4 stacks, and she took him through the method of them. That the observation was taken at the sluice arch on the flood, at the stone, with a leaden line off a fixed iron staple that had been in that brickwork since before anybody could say. That the sill was the datum, and the sill had not moved because it was 5 ton of Kentish rag laid on oak piles, that the tide gauge belonging to the mill had been made by Nairn of London in 1782, and was graduated in feet, inches, and eighths, and that the mill sill stood, by a levelling that Ephraim Ladbrok's son had done in 1789, and that she had checked in 1820, by a man off a survey ship, at Harwich for a dinner and a shilling, 3 foot 1.5 below the Trinity mark on the quay wall at Orford. Then she gave him the great tides. She did not give them out of her head. She put the volume for each year open on the table in front of him, and let him read the entry himself and copy it in his own hand, and she made him copy the whole entry, and not only the height, because the whole entry is the wind and the weather, and what the tide before it had done, and the wind and the weather are the half of it. 1692, 1703, 1717, 16 foot even, wind north-northwest, whole gale, and the note underneath in a hand 100 years old that said the water was 2 hours over the wall, and the wall stood and the Marsh took it. 1758, 1791, 15 foot 9 at 11 minutes past 2 in the morning, wind north, hard, with the tide before it never gone out. That, said Keziah Fen, and she put her finger on it. Write that down twice, Mr. Kersey, the tide before it never went out. That is the only warning anybody ever gets, and it is written in this book 4 times in 93 years, and it means the sea is being piled up the coast by weather you cannot see, and the ebb cannot get away against it. So the next flood starts from 1.5 feet up. It is not the gale that does it. The gale is only the last of it. It is the tide that would not leave. Ambrose Kersey wrote until his hand ached, and drank 3 cups of tea and forgot to be shy. At the end of it he packed his satchel and stood up, and Kezia Fenn opened the daybook. She had not thought about it. That is what she said afterwards, and it was true, and it is the thing that ought to be said about her. Because people made it out to be cunning, and it was not cunning. It was only that she had been trained by a woman who had been trained by a man who was born in the reign of Queen Anne. The rule at Kessland was that nothing left that counting house unentered. Not a sack, not a shilling, not a scrap of paper. It had been the rule since the first page of the first book, and the reason for it was that in 1739 a man had sworn in a court at Ipswich that Kesland Mill had never sent him a load it had in fact sent him, and Ephraim Ladbroke had had nothing to show, and had lost £11 and his temper, and, being the sort of man he was, had gone home and made a rule about it. So Keziah Fenn wrote in the daybook, on the 19th of July, 1823, delivered this day to Mr. Ambrose Kersey, for Mr. Vellicott of Ipswich, surveyor, being for the use of the Kesland Level Reclamation, true copies taken by him from these books in my presence of the observed heights of high water at Kesland Sluice, on the several great tides therein named, together with the reduction of this mill sill to the Trinity Mark at Orford Quay, the whole comprising 11 entries, and there was communicated to him the highest observation in these books, being 16 foot even above this sill on the 25th of December, 1717. And then, at the foot of it, in the place where the mill's rule required it, she wrote, received the above, and she turned the book round on the desk and gave him the pen. Ambrose Kersey looked at it, and at her, and being the sort of young man who has been told all his life to be careful, he read it through twice. It is only that you have had it, said Kezia. It is not a receipt for money. I know what it is, said Mr. Kersey. And he signed it, Ambrose Kersey, for W.M. Vellicott, surveyor, Ipswich, and then, because he was 23, and had been given tea and taken seriously for the first time in his working life, he added, under his own name, unprompted, in his neat clerk's hand, the highest herein being 16 feet, even above the mill-sill. Neither of them thought anything about it at all. She shut the book and put it on the shelf with the others, and walked him out to the gate, and he went off along the wall in the evening light with his satchel banging on his hip, and she went in and got the supper. They began the wall in the September. It is a thing worth seeing once, and she saw it every day for 14 months from the top of her own bank, and she never got used to it. They put 110 men on it. Bankers, they were called, and a good half of them came from the Fens and from Lincolnshire, and they lived in huts on the Marsh, and were hated by everybody, and worked like nothing anybody in that parish had seen. They dug the clay out of a borrow dyke on the landward side, and they threw it up in barrows on planks, and the barrow runs went up the growing face of the bank, at a slope that made your legs ache to look at, and a man ran up a plank with 300 weight of blue clay, and tipped it, and ran down again, and did that 140 times a day, for 2 shillings and 8 pence. By the December they had a mile of it. By the following May they had 2 miles, and the cut was dug, and the new sluice was building at the haven, with a brick culvert and 2 pairs of oak doors, and the doors were self-acting, and hung to swing seaward, so that the ebb pushed them open, and the flood pushed them shut. Jonas Thurkettle walked down to look at them in the June of 1824, and came back along the wall, and stood in the counting-house doorway for a while, without saying anything. "Well," said Keziah, "the ironwork is good," he said. "The brickwork is good. The oak is good, and they have used bolts and not spikes, and the heel irons are proper. But those doors will shut against the sea, and they will never open against it," said Jonas Thurkettle. "That is what self-acting means. It means it does what the water tells it. There is no rack on them, and no crab, and no chain, and no way in the world for a man to draw them if he wants to. So on the day when the thing you want is to let the sea in slow, through a hole you have chosen, at a place you do not mind losing, you cannot. You will stand on that culvert with your hands in your pockets and watch." Keziah Fenn looked at him. "Would you put a rack on them?" "I would put a crab and a chain on the landward pair, and I would keep a key on a nail," said the millwright. "And it would cost the subscription £41, and I have said so to their foreman, and he says it is not in the specification." Hollis Garnham came to Kessland twice. The first time was in the October of 1823, and he came in the gig with a man from the quay, and he was very pleasant. He stood in the yard, and looked at the granary, and at the wheel, and at the pond, and he said that the subscription would give her £140 for the whole property, and take over the mortgage, and she might have the cottage for her life at £1 a year, and that this was, he wished her to understand, considerably more than the thing was worth, and was offered because of the family connection. "And what would the subscription do with it?" said Keziah. "Take the bank down, and let the pond into the level," said Garnham. "It is 39 acres of good silt, and it would come in with the rest." "No," said Keziah Fenn. The second time was in the April of 1824, and he did not get down out of the gig, and the figure was £220, and he mentioned, in passing, and with his eyes somewhere else, that Mr. Gooderham's malt could just as easily be ground at the quay, and would be in time, and that a woman of sense would take the money while there was money to take. "No," said Keziah Fenn. Amelia came once, in the August of 1824, alone, in a hired chaise as far as the ferry, and on foot along the wall, in a grey merino pelisse trimmed with fur, which was the wrong thing to walk a marsh wall in, and she knew it. They sat in the mill parlour and had tea out of the 2 cups that matched. She was not unkind. That was the whole trouble with it. She asked after the mill, and listened to the answers. She said that the pond was prettier than she remembered. She said that their mother would have been pleased about the 60 quarters, which was a kind thing to say and was probably not true. She admired the clock. And then, at the door with her gloves on, she said, "Keziah, he is not a bad man. I have not said, he is a bad man. He is a man who has put £900 of his own into a thing, and cannot now hear a word against it," said Amelia Garnham. "That is all it is. If you would only leave off saying it in public. If you would say it to him at our table, quietly, he might even hear it." "He has heard it," said Keziah. He heard it in front of 200 people, and he answered it with a joke, which is what a man does when he has not got an answer. Amelia stood on the step and looked out at the pond for a while. "You were always so sure," she said, "even when we were little. It is not a comfortable thing to be near." "No," said Keziah Fen, "I don't suppose it is." And her sister went away along the wall in her good boots, and did not come back for a year and 3 months. That was a good year, in among all of it, and it is worth saying so, because most of what gets written down about people like her is the trouble. Kesland Mill ground 940 quarters in 1824. It paid off £91 of the debt and the whole of the interest, and it put a new post under the granary and a new rope on the hoist, and it kept 5 people and a boy. She was up at 3:30, or at 8, or at 1 in the morning, as the water said, and she slept in pieces, and she learned to sleep standing against a door frame for 11 minutes at a time, which is a thing that people who work tides learn, and nobody else believes. In the June the eelbucks went back on their trestles in the creek, and old Simeon Studd took her out in the punt at Slackwater to set them, which he had done every June since before she was born, and which he did in complete silence, and which was, she thought afterwards, the single most peaceable hour of that whole 2 years. The bucks are long baskets of willow, wide at the mouth and narrow at the tail, and you hang them mouth upstream in a frame, and the eels come down on the ebb in the dark in the autumn, and go into them, and in the morning you have 11 stone of eels, and a great deal of weed. And Simeon Studd sold them at the ferry to a Dutchman who came up twice a year in a wellboat and paid in silver. He was 70 that year. He had been on that marsh since he was 9. He had a way of standing on the wall with his hands behind his back and looking at nothing at all, and if you stood beside him and waited long enough he would tell you something worth more than a book. She asked him once whether the level would hold. Simeon Studd looked out over the 460 acres of it, at the new bank going up in the distance, with the barrows going along the top like beetles. "That old Marsh is a sponge, boy," he said, because he called everybody boy. "You squeeze a sponge, water goes somewhere. Ain't nobody never made water go nowhere." And Jonas Thurkettle mended things. He mended, in the 14 months from that Lady Day, the hoist, the penstock, the second pair of stones, the sack floor, the granary post, both pairs of flap doors, the staging, the crab winch on the quay, the great spur wheel, 16 cogs of hornbeam, which he cut himself out of a tree he chose himself standing in a hedge at Chillisford, and the counting-house window, which had not shut since 1809. He worked slowly. That was the first thing everybody said about him, and the second thing was that he had never once had to do a job twice. They talked, at the end of the day, on the wall, because that was where you went. Not every day. There were weeks when they said nothing to each other, but hoist and hold and let go. But there was an evening in the July of 1824, slack water, no wind at all, the pond flat as a plate and the whole sky gone the color of the inside of a shell, when she asked him why he would not be hurried, and he told her. He had been the middle of 3. His father had been a millwright at Aylsham. There had been an elder brother, Matthew, who was to have had the business. In the March of 1811, when Jonas Thurkettle was 19 and had been out of his time about 6 weeks, a farmer at Cawston wanted a wind pump put up, and wanted it by the Friday, because he had beasts drowning. And Jonas's father was laid up with a poisoned hand, and Jonas said he could do it. And he did it, and he hung the wheel on a shaft he had not checked, because there was not time to check it. And the shaft had a flaw in it that had been in the iron since the foundry. It went on the Tuesday of the week after, with his brother under it. 6 days, said Jonas Thurkettle. If I had said Thursday week, I should have looked at that shaft. There was nothing else in it. There was no bad luck in it, and there was no judgment in it. There was a man in a hurry, and a boy who wanted to be thought clever. Keziah Fenn did not say any of the things people say. She said, "Is that why you would not take Mr. Duffield's last 4 year of money and go?" Jonas Thurkettle looked at the water. "I would have gone," he said. "I would have gone anywhere that would have let me do the work right. It only took a long time to find." They stood there a while. Their hands were on the rail of the little footbridge over the waste hatch, about 4 inches apart, and stayed 4 inches apart, and both of them knew it, and neither of them moved, and after a bit she said the tide was on the turn, and she had to write it down. The 19th of September, 1824, was the top of the equinoctial springs, and it was a Sunday. There was a great deal in that mill on that Sunday. There were 41 quarters of pale malt belonging to Messrs. Catchpole and Nunn of Woodbridge, lying in sacks on the granary floor and on the meal floor of the mill itself, ready to be ground on the Monday and Tuesday tides, and shipped in a barge on the Wednesday. Keziah slept at the cottage. Jonas slept in the loft over the granary. Nat Pallant had gone home to his mother's for the Sunday night, which he did once a month. At about 2:15 in the morning she woke up because the sound was wrong. That is all it was. There is a note that a full pond makes at the top of a spring tide, which is nearly nothing. A kind of pressure in the ear. The sound of 39 acres of water lying still against a bank. It had gone. She was out of the door in her shift and a shawl with the lantern in 3/4 of a minute. The waste hatch was up. The waste hatch at Kessland is a heavy oak paddle in a frame at the far end of the quay wall, and it is there so that you can dump the pond in a hurry if you have to. And it is drawn by a chain and a rack, and it is shackled down when it is not in use. And it had not been drawn in 11 years, and it was standing up 2'6", and the whole pond was going out through it, in the dark, with a noise, like a train, which nobody in that county had ever heard, so she did not think that at the time. And under the mill the flap doors were propped. Somebody had put 2 lengths of 4x3 from her own stack under the heels of both flap doors, so that when the flood came, the doors could not fall to behind it. So the pond had filled on the flood, as it always did. And then, instead of being locked in, it had gone straight back out again, down the falling tide through the open doors, and out through the waste hatch, and gone on going, so that when the water outside dropped below the sill, the pond did not stand up above it holding its head. It went out with it. And when the next flood came up the creek, it came in through a mill that had nothing in it to hold it, and it came in fast and high on the top of an equinoctial spring, and it came up through the wheel race and over the sill and onto the meal floor. Salt water got into 31 quarters of Catchpole and Nunn's pale malt. You cannot dry it. That is the thing people always ask. You cannot dry it and sell it as anything, because salt in malt is not a stain. It is in the corn, and any brewer in England will find it in the first mash, and the beer will be undrinkable, and he will never buy from you again as long as he lives. 31 quarters at 62 shillings is 96 pounds and 2 shillings, and the barge and the contract, and Messrs. Catchpole and Nunn. Jonas Thurkettle got the hatch down at 10 minutes to 3 with the boy's crowbar and both hands, and cut himself to the bone across the left palm doing it. And at first light, Simeon Studd, who had come along the wall at 5 without being sent for, because he had heard the water from his own bed a mile off, stood at the hatch frame with the chain in his hands and turned it over twice. "Ain't broke," he said. He held it up. "That there shackle been took off," he said. "Pins out clean. That's a spike done that. And a man that know what he's about. And them props under the doors is your own timber, cut square, off your own stack, by somebody as had a saw and time, and no fear of being come upon." They went to the magistrate at Sudbourne on the Tuesday. He was a fair-minded gentleman, and he listened for half an hour, and he said at the end of it, and he was right, that there was not one thing there that a jury would hang a cat on, and that he could not commit a man he could not name, and that it was very hard, and would she take a glass of wine. Keziah Fenn went home and sat in the counting-house for about an hour, and did not write anything. Then she got up and put on her bonnet and walked to Woodbridge. It is 15 miles by the road that goes round the head of the river, and she did it in 4 hours and 40 minutes. And she was in the counting-house of Messrs. Catchpole and Nunn at 11:30 in the morning on the Wednesday, which was before their own carrier had got there with the news, which was the whole point of walking. She told them what had happened, standing up, in about 4 minutes, without a word of self-defense in it. Mr. Nunn, who was 60 and had known Judith Ladbroke, asked her what she proposed. £96 2 shillings, said Keziah Fenn. "I will pay it. I have not got it. I will pay you £8 a quarter for 3 years and interest at 5, and I will give you my note for the whole, and you shall have first call on every sack that leaves my mill until it is done, and I will grind your malt at 4 pence under my own price for those 3 years, so that you are not out of your money and not out of your convenience either. We could put you in the county court and sell your mill," said Mr. Catchpole, who was the younger and the harder. "You could," said Keziah Fenn. "You would get £140 for it, and a great deal of talk, and you would be 400 quarters a year worse off from the Michaelmas, because there is nobody else on this river will grind at my price and name your hour." There was a pause of the sort that lasts a long time in a counting-house. They took the note. She walked home. She got in at 9:30 at night, and there was a light in the counting-house, and Jonas Thurkettle sitting at the desk, with his left hand wrapped in a piece of clean sheet, and the day book open. Because somebody had had to write the tide down at 4:07, and he had gone out along the wall with the lantern and the lead, and done it himself, left-handed, and had got it. She checked. Within 2 inches. "You are late," he said. "I have been to Woodbridge." "I know where you have been," said Jonas Thurkettle. "Simeon told me at 6 this morning, and I have been sat here since 4 this afternoon like a fool waiting to see which way you would come back." He turned the book round. "Did they take it?" he said. "They took it." He looked at her for a moment, and then he put his head down on his good arm on the desk, and did not say anything at all, and she stood in the doorway and let him. The wind went into the north on the 7th of November, 1824, and stayed there. That by itself is nothing. It does that every November. On the 8th, the barometer at the mill, which had been made in London in 1794 and hung in the counting-house on a nail, began to go down, and went down all day steadily without a check, further than Keziah Fenn had ever seen it go, and by the evening of the 8th it had fallen almost an inch, and was still falling. That is something. That is not nothing. But barometers fall in November too, and half a dozen people in that town had one and looked at it and said it was going to blow. The thing that mattered happened at 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the 8th, and only 3 people in England noticed it, and 2 of them were on the wall at Kessland. The tide did not go out. Low water on the afternoon of the 8th of November was due at 9 minutes past 4. At 9 minutes past 4, Keziah Fenn stood on the sluice arch with the lead in her hand, and the water was 2 foot 11 above the sill, where it should have been 11 inches. It had ebbed for 4 hours, and it had ebbed sluggishly, and then it had simply stopped, a long way up, and lain there, heaving a little, as if there were something behind it. Simeon Studd was standing beside her. He looked at the water for a long time. "That old water don't want to go," he said. Keziah went and got the book for 1791 and read the entry for the 22nd of December out loud to him standing on the wall in the wind, and the words in it were, "The ebb of this afternoon never went away, but lay in the creek 2 foot, and better all the low water, wind north, hard." And the entry for the next day was 15 foot 9. She was in the town at 6:30 that evening. She went to Mr. Gooderham first, and Mr. Gooderham believed her at once, entirely, without a question, and had his men on the malt floors moving sacks up before she was out of the yard, and afterwards said publicly, and often, and at some cost to himself, that she had saved him £1,100, and that anybody who wanted to laugh about it might laugh at him. She went to the Reverend Mr. Ashby, who did not understand a word of it, but who knew her, and who unlocked the church and sent the sexton round the low streets, and who had, by midnight, 190 people and 11 dogs in the nave on the hill. She went to the constable, and to the ferryman, and to the 2 publicans, and to the master of the collier lying at the quay, who took one look at the glass in his own cabin, and got a second anchor down and slacked away, and saved his vessel. And at 8 o'clock she went to the counting-house on the quay, and Hollis Garnham was there, working late, with 2 candles and the subscription book open. She told him. She told him about the ebb that had not gone away, and she told him what the book said, and she told him that the flood at 11 minutes past 1 that night was going to run somewhere between 15 and 16 foot above her sill, and that his bank stood at 13 foot 6, and that it would be 2 hours under water, and that when it went, it would go in a dozen places at once, and the level would fill in less than an hour. And she told him the one thing that could still be done, which was to send men down to the haven that night with beetles and crowbars, and cut a gap in his own wall at the low corner by the ferry, deliberately 40 foot of it, where there was nothing behind but rough marsh, and let the sea in there, slow, through a hole of his own choosing, and let it fill the level quietly from that one place, so that the wall came under no head at all, and the 460 acres took the water instead of the town. "Cut my wall," said Hollis Garnham. "You will lose the grass for a season and 40 foot of bank," said Keziah Fenn. It will cost you £200 and you will have it shut again by Christmas. He got up and stood with his back to the fire. Do you know what you are asking me to do? He said. You are asking me to go out tonight in front of 600 subscribers worth of this town and take a spade to my own bank on the word of a woman with a diary. And if nothing happens, if it blows a bit and rains and the tide comes up ordinary and goes down again, I am the man who cut his own wall. I am finished in this county by Saturday. And if it does happen, said Keziah. Then it is an act of God, said Hollis Garnham, and the wall was built to Mr. Vellicott's report, and no man alive can be blamed for weather. He said that. He said it at about 8:15 on the evening of the 8th of November, 1824, in his own counting house, and there was a clerk in the next room with the door open who heard it. And it took 9 weeks to come back on him, and it came back like a horse. She sent Nat Pallant to her sister's house with a note. It said 4 words, "Go up to the church." Amelia Garnham read it, and put on her cloak, and went, and took the 2 servants and the cook with her, and was in the nave on the hill at 11 o'clock. And her husband was not. And everybody saw that too. At Kessland they had 5 hours. She sent Reuben Chenery and Jarvis Mean home to their own wives at 7, and would not hear a word about it. Then there were 4 of them, Keziah, Jonas Thurkettle, Simeon Studd, and Nat Pallant, who had run the whole way back from the town and was told to go home, and did not. They got what could be got up. There is a limit to what 4 people can carry up a ladder in 5 hours, and the limit is about 80 sacks. They put the books first. That was the first thing that went up. Before a single sack, before the cash box, before anything, 93 brown calf volumes carried up 2 flights in 4 armfuls and put on the top of the granary meal bins under a tarpaulin, and the 94th, which was the current one, went up in Keziah's own hands. Then the seed corn, then the tools, then the cash box and the papers, and then, at 9:30, with the flood 4 hours off, she went out and drew the waste hatch and threw the whole pond away. Jonas Thurkettle stood on the quay wall in the dark and watched 39 acres of water go out through a 2-foot-6 hatch on the last of the ebb, roaring, and he understood it in about 4 seconds, which is why she had hired him. You are making a hole. I am making a hole, said Keziah Fenn. There were 11 million cubic feet of room in that pond when it was empty, and there was more behind it if the water would go on into the old back marsh through the head gate at the top, which had been shut since 1780, and which Jonas Thurkettle and Nat Pallant went up and opened with a crowbar and a hammer and 40 minutes of swearing, and beyond that another 60 acres of rough saltings with nothing on it but reeds and a heronry. And at the mill she had them chock both flap doors wide open, and draw the penstock to the top, and unship the boards from the tail race, and open every door in the building, front and back, so that when it came it would come through and not against. The whole of it, said Jonas Thurkettle. You know what that does to your stones, and your gearing, and your wheel, and your granary floor. I know what it does. The floor will go. The meal floor will go, and the sack floor over it will very likely follow. I know what it does, said Keziah Fenn. Then he went and got the crowbar and knocked out the last chock himself, because he had understood something else by then, which was that she was going to say afterwards that she had done it, and that if it went wrong, it had better be true. At about 11 o'clock, Simeon Studd took the punt. There were 11 bankers asleep in 3 huts on the level, out in the middle of the 460 acres where the wall would go. They were Fen men and Lincolnshire men, and nobody in that town would have crossed the road for them. Simeon Studd went out along the level wall in the dark in the punt with a lantern, and got all 11 of them up and out, and started them walking for the ferry, and turned round and came back. Somewhere between the second hut and the ferry the wall went. It went at about 1:15, which was 26 minutes before the top of the tide, and it did not go in one place. It went in 14, and the first 11 of them went within about 1.5 minutes of each other, all along the seaward face, in the way that Kezia-Fen had stood up and said in the King's Head that it would, because when a seawall is overtopped along its whole length, the water pours over the back of it and cuts the landward slope out from underneath, and then the bank is not a bank, it is a row of sandcastles. The level filled in 51 minutes. They found the punt on the 3rd day at Havergate with a hole in it. They found Simeon Studd on the 6th in the reeds a mile above the ferry, and the 11 bankers who had walked to the town and been let into the church by Mr. Ashby carried him up the hill on their shoulders and would not let anybody else take a turn. At Kesland the sea came over the quay wall at 11 minutes to 1 and went straight through the mill. It came through the open flap doors and up over the sill and across the meal floor 2 feet deep, and out at the landward doors and into the pond, which took it, and went on taking it, and filled, and went over the head gate into the back marsh, and took that too, and went on rising. The mill stood. It stood because it had nothing to push against, which is the whole of what she had done, and because it had been built in about 1500 and something by men who put it on oak piles and made it heavy at the bottom. At 11 minutes past 1 in the morning of the 10th of November, 1824, at the top of the greatest tide that had come up that river since before the French War, with her meal floor drowned, and her granary floor drowned, and her wheel under water to the shaft, and her whole living going out from under her feet, Kezia-Fen went along the top of her own bank in the dark, with a lantern in her teeth and the lead and line in her hands, to the sluice arch, and lay flat on the brickwork, and took the height of the water at the stone. Jonas Thurkettle had hold of her ankles. And she came back, and went up the granary ladder to the top floor, where the books were under the tarpaulin, and knelt down on the boards with the lantern beside her, and opened the 94th book, and wrote 10th November. 15'4" above sill at 11 minutes past 1, wind north-northwest, whole gale, ebb of the 8th never gone away. Level wall gone. Pond and back marsh opened at 9:30 to take it. Mill open through. Nothing ground on this tide. In the morning it was very quiet and very bright. That is the other thing nobody puts in. After a night like that, the wind goes and the sky washes itself, and you get a clean, pale blue December-looking day with the sun low and everything shining, and the world lies there with its inside turned out and looks beautiful. 460 acres of the Kesland level lay under salt water to the depth of 5 and 6 feet, with the tops of the new drain banks showing in lines and the roof of one hut floating. 341 sheep were drowned, and 11 bullocks, and 2 horses, and a great many hares, and every partridge on the Marsh. In the town, the water had come into the low streets to about 18 inches and into the maltings yard to 2 feet, and had gone away again by 6 in the morning, and it had spoiled a great deal of furniture and 1,100 weight of grocer's sugar and the parish registers for a period of 40 years, which were dried leaf by leaf on the church pews by 4 women over 11 days. Nobody in that town was drowned. Not one. They lost Simeon Studd, who was not in the town, and who had gone out on purpose. At Kesland, the meal floor was gone, 6 bays of it, boards and joists together, and the sack floor over it had come down at one end. The granary floor had buckled. The wheel was under silt to the shaft, and 11 of Jonas Thurkettle's new elm floats were split. There were 4 inches of salt mud over everything in the building, including the counting house desk, and 11 weeks of work in scraping it out. The pond was full of it. That is what nobody expects. A tide like that does not leave you water, it leaves you land. 2 feet of grey estuary silt over 39 acres, which meant that the pond had lost the greater part of its capacity in one night, and would give her, when she got the mill running at all, about half the head she had had before. She stood on the bank at 8 in the morning of the 10th, and looked at the whole of it in the beautiful light, and Jonas Thurkettle stood beside her with his hands hanging. "Well," said Keziah Fenn at last, "we did it, and I would do it again. And now be so good as to go and get the boy some breakfast, because he has been sat on the granary stair for an hour, and he thinks nobody has seen him crying. For 11 days she was a heroine. It is worth putting down exactly, because of what came after. For 11 days that town could not do enough. Mr. Gooderham told everybody who came within reach of him what she had done and what it had cost her. The Reverend Mr. Ashby preached on it, badly, on the Sunday. Men came down the wall from the town on their own time with shovels and got 4 inches of mud off her counting house floor. Somebody left a ham. Then, on the 20th of November, there was a letter in the Ipswich paper. It was a long letter, and it was very well written, and it was signed Hollis Garnham, Chairman, on behalf of the Committee of Subscribers to the Kesland Level Reclamation. It said that the tide of the 10th had been of a height unprecedented in the memory of man, and unforeseeable by any human means, and that the works had been executed to the report and specification of Mr. Vellacott of Ipswich, an engineer of the first respectability, and that no blame could attach to any person for an act of Providence. And then, in the 4th paragraph, it said this: that the committee felt it their duty, however painful, to lay before the public a circumstance which had been made known to them by several witnesses, namely, that at about 9:30 on the night in question, some hours before the top of the tide, the ancient tide pond at Kesland, containing 39 acres, was deliberately discharged by its present occupier, that the head gate at the upper end of that pond, which had been kept shut for above 40 years, was at the same time broken open with a crowbar, and that the mill itself was thrown open from end to end, so that the sea was admitted freely through it, that the whole of this great body of water was thereby thrown upon the upper part of the level, and that the committee were advised that the breach in the sea-wall, which occurred not on the open coast but upon the inner face at the north end, was in all probability occasioned thereby. The committee, said the letter, made no imputation of ill intention. They were sure that the person in question had acted from motives of alarm. They observed only that the operations of a great work of drainage were not a proper subject for the experiments of persons unacquainted with engineering. It was a beautiful piece of work. She said so herself years later. There was not one sentence in it you could take hold of. It did not say she had drowned the level. It said the committee had been advised. The town turned in 4 days, not all of it. Never all of it. But the ham stopped, and the men with shovels stopped, and 2 men who had come down the wall on the Thursday did not come on the Monday, and there was talk in the Jolly Sailor about foreigners' huts and 11 men's beds, and what a woman had been doing opening gates in the dark, and a fortnight later Nat Pallant walked into the town for nails and was set on by 3 men at the top of Chandler's Row and came back with his mouth split and would not say a word about it, and had to be held down by Jonas Thurkettle while the mouth was sewn. Messrs. Catchpole and Nunn wrote to say that in the present state of things they must ask for the note to be secured on the property. Mr. Gooderham stood up in the Jolly Sailor on a Saturday night in December, which he had never done in his life, and said that Hollis Garnham was a liar and would not take it back, and it cost him the quay trade for 2 years, and he never once mentioned it to her. And in the December, Jonas Thurkettle borrowed a spirit level. He borrowed it from a surveyor at Woodbridge who had known his father, and he made a levelling staff himself out of a piece of clean deal, plain straight and marked off with his own bill and a steel rule and nothing else, and he took Nat Pallant, and they went out on to the level wall on the 2nd of December in a hard frost. They were 9 days at it. They started at the Haven Sluice and they went round the whole 3 miles of it, and they took a level every 20 yards, and where there was a breach they went down into it, and levelled the stumps at both cheeks, and Keziah Fenn walked behind them in a man's coat with the book, and wrote down every reading as it was called, 441 of them, and reduced every one of them that same night at the kitchen table to the mill sill, because the mill sill was the only datum in that parish that anybody could swear to. This is what they found, and it is a matter of record because it was read into the proceedings in the January. The crest of the Kessland level seawall, as executed, stood at a mean height of 13 foot 2 inches above Kessland Millsill. Its highest point, at the Haven end, was 13 foot 9 in 11 places, of which 4 were in the north length where the wall first went. It stood at less than 13 foot. Mr. Vellicott's specification, as read out to the public meeting of the 24th of June, 1823, would have put it at 13 foot 6. And Mr. Vellicott's amended section, which he had drawn in the September of 1823, after receiving certain particulars from Kessland Mill, and which had never been shown to any public meeting at all, put it at 16 foot 6. They also, on the 7th day, in the freezing mud at the bottom of the 3rd breach, dug out and got a rope on, and dragged up with a horse 1 leaf of the landward pair of doors from the new self-acting sluice at the Haven, 11 feet by 4, oak with its ironwork on it. Jonas Thurkettle cleaned it off and stood it up against the wall of the granary and looked at it for a long time. "There is your rack," he said. "There is your crab. There is your chain. There is the eye that a chain would go on." And he put his hand flat on 11 feet of plain oak, where none of those things were. The commissioners of sewers, for the levels of that river, sat at the King's Head at Orford on the 11th of January, 1825. A commission of sewers is not a court in the way people think. It is older than most of the things that are, and in those days it was the whole of the law on a coast like that. 6 or 8 gentlemen with a commission under the Great Seal, a jury of 24 men who live on the Marsh and know it, an expeditor, and a clerk. They go and look. They hear anybody who wants to be heard, on oath, without much regard to how it would be done at assizes. And then the jury makes a presentment, which says what happened and whose fault it was and what is to be done, and the commissioners make a decree upon it, and they can charge the cost on the lands and on the persons who own them, and there is no appeal that is worth anybody's money. Mr. Rednall, the attorney, came down the wall to Kesland in the December, through the frost, and sat in the half-repaired counting house with his hat on his knees. "I will act for you," he said, "and I will not send you a bill, and before you argue with me I will tell you why. In 1819 an old woman came into my office and made me alter 3 words in a will, because she said I had been slovenly, and she was right, and it is the only time in 31 years anybody has caught me at it. I have wanted to do something about that ever since." He opened his box. "Now," he said, "tell me everything you have got, and start with the worst of it, and do not be brave with me, because I am too old for it." She told him about the waste hatch, and the head gate and the mill thrown open, which was the worst of it, because it was all true, and she had done every bit of it herself. Mr. Rednall wrote for a while, "And what have you got on the other side?" he said. Keziah Fenn put her hand on the pile of brown calf on the table. 94 books, she said, a stone, and a receipt. The long room of the King's Head held about 200 people if they stood, and on the 11th of January it held rather more than that, and there were another 80 on the stairs and in the yard. At the table across the end sat 5 commissioners and their clerk. The jury of 24 marshmen sat on 2 forms down the left side with their hats on their knees, and there was not a man among them under 50. And between them they had something over 900 years of that river. The committee of subscribers had brought down an attorney from Ipswich called Mr. Sisson, who was clever, and an engineer called Mr. Bolingbroke, who had done a great deal of work in Lincolnshire and was accustomed to being believed. Hollis Garnham sat at the end of the front bench in the bottle-green coat with his arms folded. Keziah Fenn sat at the back with Mr. Rednall, in her working gown, because she had not got another one that was not black, and she was not going to borrow. Mr. Sisson opened for the committee, and he did it well. The works, he said, were executed to a report by a gentleman of standing. The tide of the 10th of November was of a violence unexampled. No prudence could have provided against it. And there was, he was sorry to say, a further circumstance, which he would put no higher than the evidence would carry it, that a very large body of water had been let loose from the Kesland tide pond upon the upper level some hours before the disaster by a person who had made no secret of it. Mr. Bolingbroke was sworn, and said that in his judgment the wall was properly constructed and of an ample section, and that he had built 40 miles of such walls in Lincolnshire and Cambridgeshire, and that the tide of the 10th of November was, in his opinion, the highest that had occurred upon that coast within the memory of man. Mr. Rednall got up. "Within the memory of man," said Mr. Rednall. "Yes, Mr. Bolingbroke, whose memory? I beg your pardon. You have used a form of words, sir, which is a very old and a very respectable form of words, and which means precisely nothing unless somebody has been remembering on purpose. Whose memory? Yours? I have been upon this coast 11 years. Then let us be exact, said Mr. Rednaw. You mean that it is the highest tide within 11 years. I mean that there is no record of a higher. Ah, said Mr. Rednaw, now that is a different thing altogether, and it is the thing I wish to come to. Are you telling these gentlemen, on your oath, that there is no record? I am aware of none. Did you look for one? There was a pause of about 3 seconds, and everybody in that room heard it. Mr. Rednaw sat down and said, I shall call Miss Fenn. She was on her feet for an hour and 40 minutes. She was not a speaker. She did not raise her voice once, and twice the commissioners had to ask her to come forward. But she had been asked a question about tides in front of a room full of men who lived on a tide, and she had been answering that question in her own head since she was 5 years old. She put the 94 books on the table. It took 2 men to carry them, and it took some while, and the room watched every journey, and that was worth more than anything she said. She explained the datum, and the staple in the brickwork, and the lead and line, and the reduction to the Trinity mark at Orford. She explained who had written each hand, and when. She let the clerk take any volume he liked at random, and open it at any page he liked, and she told him, before he read it out, what sort of thing he would find on it, and she was right 11 times running, and on the 12th she said, that would be a page with nothing on it, but a line drawn across, because that was the week the mill had been let stand for the kiln to be rebuilt, and there would be a note at the foot in her own hand. And there was. She gave them the great tides. She gave them the ebb that will not go away. And then she said, Gentlemen, you have all heard that this was a tide beyond anything known. I have got it written down in my own hand, taken at the arch at 11 minutes past 1 in the morning, with my mill going to pieces under me, and it was 15 foot 4 above my sill. That is 5 inches lower than the tide of the 23rd of December, 1791, which 4 men now living in this parish stood and watched. And it is 8 inches lower than the tide of the 25th of December, 1717, which took the sea over the old wall for 2 hours by the clock, and which that Marsh took without a house, in this town being wet. The 10th of November was not the worst tide this river has had. It was the 4th. And if you do not choose to take my books, she said, then do not take them. There is a stone at the bottom of my wall with the whole of it cut into it, and it was cut by men who are dead, and it does not belong to me, and it has no interest in this business, and it is a mile from this room, and low water is at 20 minutes past 2. The commissioners conferred for about a minute and a half. Then the senior of them, Sir Miles Everard, who was 71 and had gout, and who afterwards said it was the best afternoon of his life, stood up and adjourned the sitting to the sluice arch at Kesland Mill. 280 people walked a mile down a marsh wall in January. It was one of those bright, hard, frosty afternoons, with no wind, and the sun low and red, and the whole line of them went out along the top of the bank, in single file and in twos, 5 commissioners, 24 jurymen, 2 attorneys, an engineer from Lincolnshire, a corn factor, and the population of a small town, and their breath went up in one long ribbon over the marsh, and the Redshank got up in front of them the whole way. At the mill they went down the bank on to the hard mud below the arch, and they stood in it, 300 people in their best boots in the estuary, and they looked at a stone. It was still there. It is still there now. 5 plain grooves cut across a slab of pale stone set into the brickwork, with a date under each, and above them 6 words, nearly weathered out, and across the whole face of the brickwork, at a height that everybody could see and nobody had to be told about, a line of dried black weed and reed and dirty froth, level as a shelf, which is what a tide leaves behind it, and which had been sitting there since the 10th of November. The rack line of the 10th of November was 5 inches below the groove marked 1791. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Keziah Fenn, in her working gown, with the mud over her boots, reached up and laid her hand flat on the 1717 line, which she had had to be held up under the arms to reach when she was 6 years old, and which she could now touch with her arms straight, and said, "That one." And an old man in the jury called Ezra Whiting, who was 82, and who had been 10 years old in 1791, and had been brought down that wall on his father's shoulders the morning after, said out loud in front of everybody, and not to anybody in particular, "That's right, boy, that's just where he come to." They went back and sat again at 4 o'clock by candlelight, and that was when it finished. Mr. Rednall called Mr. Ambrose Kersey. Mr. Kersey, who was now 24 and had been sick with nerves in the yard, was shown the Kesland Day Book, open at the 19th of July, 1823, and identified his own signature, and the words he had added under it of his own motion, which were, the highest herein being 16 feet, even above the mill sill. Mr. Rednall then called Mr. Velicott of Ipswich, surveyor, who had come down at his own charge and had asked to be called. Mr. Velicott produced his amended section of the 12th of September, 1823, and swore that upon receiving the Kesland observations he had at once revised his design, and had raised the crest of the proposed wall to 16 foot 6 above the mill sill, with a note in the margin in his own hand referring to the tide of 1717, and that he had sent that section to the committee, and that he had never afterwards been consulted about the execution of the work, and that the wall as built was not his wall. Mr. Sisson rose and objected to a great many things, and was overruled on all of them by a gouty old gentleman who had walked a mile through a marsh that afternoon and was in no mood. And then Mr. Rednall said, "I will ask that the committee's minute book be produced." It was produced, because a commission of sewers can do that. The minute of the 11th of October, 1823, was read out by the clerk in a flat voice to a completely silent room. It resolved, on the motion of the chairman, that the crest of the wall be executed at 12 foot 6 above ordinary spring-high water in accordance with the original report, and that the amended section be not adopted, the additional earthwork being estimated to cost £1,140. Mr. Rednall let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "There is one more thing, sir, and it is a small thing, and Miss Fenn has asked that it be put, and I did not at first see the good of it. The observations in these books were taken with an instrument. It is a brass tide gauge made by Nairn of London in 1782, and it belonged to that mill for 41 years, and it is not in that mill now. By the will of the late Mrs. Judith Ladbroke, dated 1819, that gauge was left to Mr. Hollis Garnham together with 1 shilling, to be delivered into his own hand, in person before witnesses, and without any explanation whatsoever. It was so delivered in the parlour of Kesland Mill Cottage on the 25th of February, 1823, in front of 6 people, 4 of whom are in this room. Mr. Rednell took off his spectacles. "I confess I thought it was an old woman's spite," he said. "I drew that clause myself, and I thought she was being cruel, and I said so to her, and she looked at me the way she looked at people and said, 'Mr. Rednell, mind your own trade.' She was putting the instrument into his hand. She was 4 years dead before any of this began, and she had never seen that plan and never heard of that subscription. And she knew what was coming up this river, and she put the measure of it into that gentleman's own hand before witnesses, so that on the day he stood up and said that nobody could have known, there would be 1 person in England who could say that he had had the means of knowing in his pocket for 21 months. The jury of 24 Marshmen went out at 7 and came back at 20 minutes to 9. The presentment of the jury was read by their foreman, a Marshman from Aiken named Josiah Rose, who had never read anything out loud in his life except the responses, and who did it very slowly. They presented that the sea-wall of the Kesland Level Reclamation was insufficient in height, being on a mean 13'2" above Kesland Mill sill, and had been overtopped along its whole length for a period they computed at 1 hour and 50 minutes, and had thereafter failed from the landward face by scour, in 14 places, in the manner sworn to. They presented that the breach was not occasioned by the discharge of the Kesland Tide Pond, the said pond discharging into the back marsh and not into the level, the two being separated by the old ferry wall which stood and stands. They presented that the opening of the Kesland Pond, the head gate and the mill on the night of the 9th and 10th of November had received into the said pond, back marsh and mill, a quantity of water which they were advised could not be less than 14 million cubic feet, and that in their judgment, being men who lived upon that water, the low streets of the town had thereby been spared not less than 2 feet, and they desired that this be entered. They presented that the tide of the 10th of November, 1824, was not without example, but was the 4th highest of which there is any record upon that river, and they referred to the tide books of Kesland Mill and to the stone at Kesland Sluice, both of which they had inspected. And they presented, and they had put it in themselves, and would not be talked out of it, that the death of Simeon Studd, Marshman, of Kesland, aged 70 years, had been occasioned in the saving of 11 lives, and that it ought to be written down somewhere that was not a parish register. The decree of the commissioners followed on the 3rd of February. The wall was to be rebuilt to 16'6" above Kesland Mill sill, turfed with a berm and with a rack, crab and chain upon the landward doors of the haven sluice, and the whole at the charge of the subscribers, and the estimate was £4,300. There were 600 shares of £10. Mr. Hollis Garnham held 91 of them. He sold the steam mill on the quay in the June of 1825, and the house with the fanlight in the September, and in the November he took a clerk's place with a corn house at Hull at £110 a year, which is not nothing, and is not what he had been. He did not go to prison, and he was not ruined in the way people mean when they say the word with pleasure. He was a man of 36, who had been the largest figure in a small town, and who spent the rest of his life being a competent employee in a large one, and he lived until 1861, and he never came back. Amelia Garnham walked down the wall to Kesland on the 4th of March, 1825, on foot from the town in a plain stuff gown, because the Merino police had gone with the rest of it. She stood in the yard for a while before she knocked. Keziah came out with her sleeves pushed up and her hands full of tallow because they were greasing the new shaft, and the two of them stood and looked at each other across 11 feet of frozen mud. "I am not going to say he was right," said Amelia. "I never asked you to." "I am not going to say he was wrong either," said Amelia Garnham, not out loud, not for the rest of my life, because I am going to Hull with him on the 11th, and there will be nobody there but us. So I have come to say the only thing I can say, which is that our mother could not read, and our father could not swim, and one of us has got something. And it was never me, and I have known it since you were 9 years old, and I have not been able to be pleased about it, and I am sorry." Keziah Fenn wiped the tallow off her hands on her apron. "Come in," she said. "There is a fire in the counting house, and it is the only room in the building with a floor." They wrote to each other every month for 31 years. The mill was got going again on the tide of the 2nd of April, 1825, at 11:15 at night, with 2 pairs of stones out of the 3, and a floor made of ship's deals nailed straight down over the joists. The commissioners in the same decree did a thing that nobody had asked for, and that Keziah Fenn did not hear about for 6 weeks. They ordered that the tide pond at Kesland, of 39 acres, be scoured to its ancient sill at the charge of the level rate, and they declared it a receiving ground for the level, to be kept empty at the top of every spring tide, between the 1st of October and the last of March, and they ordered that the occupier of Kesland Mill be paid out of the rate the sum of £11 a year for the keeping and the opening of it, and be answerable for its opening, and be provided with the key of the Haven Crab. £11 a year is not a great deal of money, but what it meant, and what Mr. Rednall had to explain to her twice before she believed it, was that the thing that had been laughed at in the Jolly Sailor over the ham and the hot ale, the hole in a marsh that fills twice a day, had been taken up by the commissioners of sewers, entered upon the rate, and made a public work of the county of Suffolk, and that so long as there was a level there at all, somebody was going to be paid to keep 39 acres of Kesland empty for the sea to come into. It is on the rate still. In the June of 1825, there was a sale of Mr. Garnham's effects at the house with the fanlight, and half the town went to look at the furniture. Jonas Thurkettle went in the afternoon and stood at the back and bought one lot, which was a black japanned tin case containing a brass-tied gauge by Nairn of London, graduated in feet, inches and eighths, catalogued among the odd items and knocked down to him at 2 shillings and 6pence, because nobody else in the room knew what it was. He did not give it to her that day. He waited 11 days, until the 29th, which was a spring tide and a Sunday and low water at 6 in the evening. Then he took her down the bank to the sluice arch with a hammer and a chisel and the case in his coat pocket. He had been at the stone that afternoon and had cut the 6th groove a hand's breadth below the 1791 line, and the date under it, plain and square, the way the man in 1717 had done it. Keziah Fenn stood in the mud and looked at it for a long time. "Who told you to do that?" she said. "Nobody," said Jonas Thurkettle. "That is the point of it. Somebody has done it every time since 1692, and not one of them was told, and there is no office and no wages, and nobody in that town could tell you whose business it is. It is whoever picks up the chisel." Then he took the case out of his pocket and put it in her hands. "I have got 12 shillings a week," he said, "and a loft over a granary, and a set of tools, and a brother in a churchyard at Aylsham, and I am 33, and there is nothing whatever to recommend me, except that I knew what you were from the gate, before I ever saw your face, because I stood outside it a quarter of an hour, and listened to what was wrong with your wheel, and thought, whoever is inside there has been carrying this on their own." She opened the case. "I have not got a ring," said Jonas Thurkettle, "and I would not insult you with one, because I have seen what you keep on a bit of cord round your neck. I have got you back the thing they took a joke out of." Keziah Fenn stood in 4 inches of Suffolk mud, with a brass tide gauge in her 2 hands. "Then say it properly," she said. "Will you have me?" said Jonas Thurkettle. "Yes," said Keziah Fenn. They were married at the church on the hill on the 9th of August, 1825, by the Reverend Mr. Ashby, in a service that had to be moved forward 2 hours because of the tide, which the whole congregation thought entirely reasonable. Mr. Gooderham gave her away. Mr. Rednall came, and Mr. Vellacott came from Ipswich, and Ambrose Kersey came and got drunk and had to be walked round the churchyard. Reuben Chenery came in a coat nobody had ever seen. Nat Pallant, who was 20 and had been bound apprentice to Jonas Thurkettle in the April, held the horses and cried again, and 7 men came down from Lincolnshire, and the Fens, at their own charge, having walked or worked their way, being 7 of the 11 who had been got off the Kesland level in a punt at 11 o'clock at night by an old man who did not come back. The wall was rebuilt to 16 foot 6 in 1826. It was overtopped by 4 inches on the 1st of February, 1853, and by 11 inches on the 30th of November, 1897, and it stood on both occasions, and it is standing now, and the grass on the top of it is the best grazing in that parish. Fenn and Thurkettle, millers of Kesland, paid off the whole of the debt in 1834, put in a 3rd pair of stones in 1838, built a new granary in 1842, and ground on that tide without an engine of any kind until 1899. They had 5 children. The 3rd, a girl, could stand on the wall at 7 years old with her back to the sea, and call the hour of the tide within a quarter, and her mother tested her the way Judith Ladbroke had tested her, and then went down the bank and stood by herself at the sluice arch for a while. The books went on. They went past the 100th volume in 1831, and past the 150th in 1881, and they were still being kept, twice a day, in the reign of King George V, by a great-granddaughter who was paid £11 a year out of the level rate for it, and thought the amount was a joke, and never once missed a tide. Keziah Thurkettle died at Kesland Mill in the January of 1884, aged 85, in the room over the counting house, in the bed that had come on a cart from Aiken in 1744, in front of the little square window that looks straight down the length of the pond. Her husband had gone 9 years before her. The last thing she is recorded as having said to a granddaughter who was sitting up with her was to ask what the water had done that morning, and to be told and to say that it was about right. She was buried on the hill, 4 graves from Simeon Stud, whose stone was paid for by 11 men from the fens and says what he did in 11 words. There is a stone at Kesland Sluice Arch as well. It is set into the brickwork below the wall, and it has 7 plain grooves cut across it now, with a date under each. And the lowest of them is nearly weathered away, and the highest of them is the one from the 12th of January, 1978. And at low water on a bright day, you can still walk out on the hard and put your hand flat on any one of them you can reach. And above them all, cut so long ago that nobody knows who did it, there are 6 words. They are not a text, and they are not a verse. Every marshman between the ferry and the point knew exactly what they meant. And so did every soul in that town who had been old enough in 1823 to stand in the parlour of the Jolly Sailor after a funeral, with a glass in his hand and the rain steaming off his coat, and hear a big man in a bottle green coat say, with his back half turned, that she had been left a hole in a marsh that fills twice a day. The 6 words are these: the water has been here before.